and the absence of the rule of law both combine to form the perfect stage for corruption to flourish. As part of our anti-corruption fight at Kaieteur Radio, we invite you to join us every Tuesday evening from 7:30 p.m. as we embark on a most needed quest to remove the tentacles of corruption from our systems. See you then for our latest program called Governance, Corruption, and Justice. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of Governance, Corruption, and Justice. I'm your hostess, editor at Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilberg, and tonight we will be placing the spotlight on matters that are pertinent to the effective governance of the oil and gas sector. To assist us in tonight's discussion are four distinguished gentlemen. They're all attached to the Oil and Gas Governance Network. Let me introduce them to you. They are Dr. Ganga Ramdas, a retired professor of business and economics at Lincoln University in the United States. Mr. Anil Prasad, a leader in enterprise technology. Dr. Jerry Jailal, he is an education consultant at the North Carolina State Department of Public Instruction. And we have, last but not least, Mr. Darsh Kusial. He's a financial researcher with qualifications in management, accounting, and securities. Gentlemen, welcome to tonight's program, and thanks for making the time to be here.
Thank you, Kiana.
Thank you, Kiana.
Thank you.
Great. So with just about an hour for tonight's discussion, I'd like to head straight into the discussion, but let's just do a few housekeeping rules. For each speaker, you're kindly asked to keep your responses within 2 to 3 minutes the most, so that we can facilitate any questions or comments that may be coming in from the audience via Facebook or on our WhatsApp number for the radio station. So with that said, let's go straight into giving each of you a minute just to introduce yourselves to our audience. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you've been doing with the Oil and Gas Governance Network. And just briefly, in a sentence or two, you can let us know why it is crucial for Guyana to have effective management of its oil and gas sector. Mr. Kusial, I'll start with you. Mr. Kusial, I believe that your mic is on mute. All right, Mr. Kusial, if you can hear us, I believe your mic is on mute. If you can just unmute that and start again. All right. In the meantime, Mr. Kusial is sorting out some technical difficulties. There, we'll move on to Mr. Prasad. Are you there with us?
Thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight. I'm Anil Prasad. I born and raised in Guyana. Went to President's College on the East Coast. Migrated to the United States about 12 years ago. Really my involvement with the oil and gas network has been around doing research and really trying to spread awareness around some of the challenges that come up with oil and gas, with the industry, specifically around environmental concerns. So I'll be speaking more to that. But, really we want to thank you for the opportunity to speak here tonight and really get the message out.
Absolutely. Mr. Kusial, have you been able to sort out?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly. Go right ahead.
Okay. Great. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So I was born in Guyana. I did my graduate and undergrad master's at the University of Toronto in computer engineering. And I worked for many years for IBM in their e-commerce division. And so I was the chief architect and chief programmer for their e-commerce software that ran sites like Costco, which is a big retailer here in North America, ran Sony, etc. As you mentioned, I've done some accounting courses, etc., and management accounting. My involvement in OGGN is, bring awareness to the oil and gas issues, and I write about financial topics such as hedging and touch on other topics such as taxes, etc.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Jailal, you can go ahead with your introduction.
Yeah, if you would allow me to pay tribute to Mr. Glenn Lau, whom I consider to be a national hero, and the Kaieteur News for spending enormous resources in its consistent, ongoing work to educate Guyanese about oil and the unfairness of the oil contract, that Guyana gets crumbs and the oil companies are laughing all the way to the bank. Also, Kiana, OGGN wants to thank you for your role in educating the nation about oil and gas through this radio program and your articles in the Kaieteur News. Not only are you a senior journalist, you're the national #1 journalist and expert in the area of oil and gas in Guyana. And I say to people of Guyana, thank you for your leadership and your excellence. I'm from the Quarantine as well as from the east coast of Demerara. And I got 2 degrees from the University of Guyana, and I got 3 more from the East Carolina University in the United States. And I've lived in Guyana, in the Bahamas, in the United Arab Emirates. I know what an oil country looks like. And I also lived in the USA. I am an author of books on education leadership, and I've taught on the 2 campuses of University of Guyana, Abu Dhabi University, and University of Mount Olive in the United States. And I got involved in the Oil and Gas Governance Network because I believe we are the generation that must change our country for the better, unite the people, and take back our country from crooked politicians and parties.
All right. Thank you very much there, sir. Dr. Ramdas, I'd like to invite you to give us a little introduction to who you are and why you're part of the Oil and Gas Governance Network.
Thank you, Kiana, for your outstanding work. I read your articles. I've never seen you. This is a wonderful opportunity to see you in person here. I'm from Covent Garden, East Bank, Demerara, near Diamond Estate. I was a high school teacher at Covent Garden and East Rumfeld Secondary. I worked with the Statistical Bureau for a year. Then I joined the Bank of Guyana, where I worked for 11 years. And then after that, I migrated to the USA, where I taught at Lincoln University for 34 years. I worked at AT&T for 1 year. I worked at the executive board of the IMF for 2.5 years. And I was a part-time MBA adjunct professor for 9 years at Wilmington University. And currently, I am utilizing my programming skills to develop business applications software for e-commerce. So those are briefly where I'm at. I have 4 degrees from the University of Guyana. I had started there as a natural science major, and then later I switched to economics and business. I got a master's degree in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And at Temple University, I have an MS in accounting and taxation and a PhD in economics. So I am with this organization, OGGN, at the invitation of Mr. Mike Prasad and Darshan and here to share my cumulative knowledge in any way I could and to observe what's developments are taking place in Guyana and to make my contribution. I happen to know Mr. Glenn Lal. He's an outstanding person. I visited him, I think it's in Wakanam or Legwan, through the health outreach that we had a program there. So right now, I'm very happy to be with this group and all the good things that they're contributing towards Guyana.
Thank you very much, sir. So Let's get straight into some of the work that OGGN has been doing. Darsh, I'll hand the floor over to you to explain this aspect, what OGGN has been up to, why it got started in the first place, who were some of the members, and some of the activism that you've been a part of.
Okay, thank you, Kian. So we actually started in 2017. As you're probably aware, there are many Guyanese. There are hundreds of thousands of Guyanese that live in New York. I'm actually I live in Toronto, but I visit New York often. And in the summer of 2017, I was in New York, and I met up with Mike Prasad, Professor Tyron Kimraj, and Charles Sugrum, and we were discussing the oil and gas topic, and this would be a transformational event, or could have a transformational effect on Guyana. And what can we contribute? We had very different backgrounds, right? Professor Taran Kimraj is an economic professor, Charles Sugrum is a CPA, etc. And we decided, hey, let's just start writing letters in the paper, talking about the issues, starting to build up our knowledge base. And along the way, we've added folks like Dr. Ramdas, Dr. Jerry Jailal, Anil Prasad, and a few other members that are listed on our website, oggn.org. Some of the things, so also we're registered in New York City. We're a nonprofit. We are not associated with any political group or government, right? And one of our main missions is educating folks on oil and gas so they can understand the various topics. I'm sure you know about the EPA/Exxon sessions that are going on right now. And they're asking for public comments. So without folks knowing like the basics, etc., how can they ask questions? How can they understand? So what we have recently done, which Dr. Jalal will talk about in a bit, is we've produced like 9 videos, which are basic videos. They're about 5 to 10 minutes long, and they introduce concepts, just very basic concepts that we might take for granted, but maybe the general public cannot grasp, right? So we have those videos. We have written a few articles. We have done some infographics that's on our website, and it shows the various oil blocks. It gives you all the information, a lot of information about the oil blocks. I think one article that was written in the papers about a week ago used that information, which shows, hey, many of these oil blocks already have PSAs that are signed. So when the government says it's going to renegotiate or it's going to negotiate new contracts, which blocks are they talking about, right? So we try to put that in a consumable way so people can easily see, hey, those blocks, they're as big as the Guyana landmass itself, which is when you see it on a map, it looks tremendous. And putting all that information, there's a lot of information out there on the government's websites and other websites. And what we try to do is to put it on our website, make it simple, make it understandable so people can start building up their knowledge base. So that's one of our missions in terms of education. Another mission is, which we share with Kaieteur News, is renegotiation of the oil contracts. And Kaieteur News has been kind enough to publish some of the pictures we have. We have like a weekly campaign going in New York City, where we try to educate the Guyanese diaspora on the issues related to oil and gas, right? So that renegotiation, one of the things that I think you're very aware of, and probably many of your members of your audience are aware of, is the Global Witness talking about 55 billion US being lost on 8 billion barrels of oil. I did a quick calculation today so I know Global Witness withdraw its report on the open oil reports, but when it withdrew those reports, it still stand by, the calculation, the spreadsheet, etc., that were used to generate those numbers. So I used the oil price today, which is hovering around $75, $76 a barrel, and I put it in that spreadsheet and I scaled it up to 9 billion barrels. Right, so when Global Witness did their calculation, it was at $65 a barrel with 8 billion barrels. So I used $75 a barrel, which is around the price what oil is today.
Yes.
With 9 billion barrels, And that 55 billion figure goes up to around 75, 76 billion dollars, which for about 780,000 Guyanese, that's about, about 95,000 US per person. For a family of four, let's say that's, let's round it up to 400,000 per person. And when you think, the average Guyanese, their income is 4,000 US per year, and you're talking about, a giveaway of 400 billion US, giveaway of 75 billion US, which works out to about $400,000 per person. That is, that's significant. That's transformational to people's lives, right? So that's one thing why we're trying to make people aware of these issues. And that global witness thing, what they did is they compared like 67 different oil regimes, and they just showed, hey, Guyana is near the bottom. We just want a deal that's put us in the middle, in the average. And when they calculated at that time, it was 55 billion. I just updated the numbers, put it in their spreadsheet, and numbers coming out right now is about 75 billion. So it's not like we're asking to be the top end, etc. We're just asking to be middle of the pack, and that's one of the reasons we're asking for a renegotiation.
Thank you very much for that. Now, since you're on the topic of renegotiation, I would like to kick off our discussion this evening on that topic. We've heard so much about the loopholes and the illegalities that characterized the Stabroek Block 2016 deal. But from the OGGN members, what future do you think we are likely to have if this agreement is not renegotiated? And I'd like to start with Dr. Ramdas on this one, and then we'll hand the floor over to Dr. Jailal.
Okay, first I'd like to make an overall comment that all costs are recoverable from the oil resources, from the sale of petroleum. There is no out-of-pocket cost that comes from the oil companies' shareholders or anywhere. If they take a loan, the interest is fully recoverable, and as well as the principal. So everything is from the oil fields, the resource that we own. The problem is that the agreement is defective, and it's defective because any resource contract that has a finite life and a fixed number of years to last would have three parts to it, or three legs to stand on, and one of those legs has been taken out by not having to pay the profit taxes. So the agreement in that regard is defective. So we can explain this further. The agreement says Guyana will get 12.5%. But if Guyana has to pay those taxes on the end profits, then Guyana will be receiving less than 12.5%. And that would violate the spirit and content of the agreement itself. And it goes on further. The company's taxes will be paid by our minister, and they have to issue a receipt as if those taxes were paid to the Guyanese government. So it doesn't matter where it's located, it's still short of the amount of taxes that Guyana has to pay out of its share to cover that cost element. So if Guyana doesn't get that, they will have to incur debts and go through the debt cycle as it had in the 90s and then in the early 2000s, and go seek debt forgiveness all over again. There is that risk, country risk of being in debt, and also over time not to be able to borrow because its default risk will also rise. So those are some future problems as a result of not getting its taxation revenues. Bear in mind that Guyana allowed the inputs duty-free entry of raw materials and sometimes finished goods. So as a result, it's giving up, as an open economy, it's giving up import duties, value-added taxes, and it's waiting for the end of the production cycle to receive the property taxes. If Guyana doesn't get those taxes, there will be a fiscal crisis eventually. There will be a debt crisis, and there will be an economic collapse depending on how the people of Guyana are receiving incomes from this industry, this new industry that was added on to an old broken down economy. So those are some of the real risks within the system.
Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Jailal, your perspective?
Kiana, we want listeners to know that the Stabroek block is a very bad template. We don't want this bad template to be the template for all the PSAs and all the blocks. And we think the government missed a good chance to change it when the Payara permit was being approved. It's the worst deal ever signed in oil in any country. This contract, there is no sanctity of contract in this contract when all the clauses are sinful. You see, sanctity means a state of quality of being holy, sacred, or saintly. In this contract, there is no sanctity. It's all sin. There is nothing pure, nothing honest about this contract. It lacks transparency. There was a lack of consultation on such an important matter. The opposition and parliament was not involved. It's a total sellout. If we are to summarize this deal, it's like Guyana saying, take all the oil and gas and give us a little freck, give us something. It surrendered our sovereignty, our rights to Exxon, Hess, and CNOOC. Parliament cannot make laws to affect the PSA. And for me, the Stabroek deal is tantamount to treason. It's a crime against the nation, giving away the country's most important natural resource for a 2% royalty and a 12.5% profit, with the oil companies getting 85.5% of all income. The oil companies get a feast, but the Guyanese people get crumbs falling from the master's table. And so far, the government has not asked for a renegotiation with Exxon. It's not that Exxon has refused, it's that our government has not asked. And our listeners should know that the recent floods show the extent of poverty and destitution in Guyana. Everything needs improvement. The city fences, flood control, we need pumps in many places. We see the vulnerability of rural areas where the working poor live. We see farms and livestock being destroyed. Guyana, in our current state, we need better schools, we need paved roads, including farm to market roads to replace mud roads. We need better bridges, healthcare, hospitals, medicines, ambulances, ferries, wage and salary increases. And we see that the oil economy is driving up prices, and building materials are scarce. We see needs in safety and security. We see the need for better technology for learning. So listeners need to know that we need lots of money now to fix our problems. And we can't wait on the trickle-down approach that the government is relying on now. And so what happens if we don't renegotiate? Our working poor will stay poor. You know, there's a time when we were young, people say if Guyana could only find oil like Trinidad and Venezuela, we would all be rich. Now we have found oil and we are not rich yet, and doesn't seem as if we're going to be. So if we have oil and are still poor, it means the business class would benefit more, and it means that the poor would stay poor. Even President Ali himself said we are a rich country of poor people. And Guyana will become Exxon Guyana, the same we were under Sugar when we were called Booker's Guyana because of the dominance of the Booker's Sugar Company that controlled what happens in Guyana long ago during colonial times. And so we can easily become Exxon Guyana, where Exxon call the shots and tell us what we do. And we would be recolonized once again by foreign companies who dominate in the oil sector. And the resource curse will be upon us. The corruption, the dominance of the business class, people still struggling. And the government should realize that if they don't renegotiate, by 2025, they can lose electoral support. And so they need to ask themselves, do they want to risk that?
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Jailal. I'd like to ask Mr. Prasad if you can share your perspectives with us, and I'll just repeat the question for those of who might now be joining us. The question before the members of the panel are, what future do you think this country is likely to have if the current administration does not renegotiate the 2016 Stabroek Block production sharing agreement?
Thanks, Kiana. So I'll take it from a different perspective, and that perspective is from the environment. So two things. One is 90% of Guyana's population resides on the coast, and a few weeks ago we all felt the effects of the flooding. Second thing is Guyana has aspirations of becoming a green state, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about those two things, what that tells you is, one, we're becoming an oil-rich nation, which means that our fiscal policies will align with the oil and gas industry, because that's going to be our bread and butter. But normally what happens is you can have your fiscal policy and environmental policies be opposing views. And that is what is happening now. What we don't realize is, yes, we may have the money to build roads and bridges and schools and everything, but 20, 30 years from now is when we'll feel the environmental impacts of the flaring of natural gas, the moving of big equipment offshore. My last research I came across, there's about 60% of Guyana's seafood catch is exported. That's about 15,000 people that depend on that for a livelihood. So my concern is around making sure that we put procedures, governance in place that we can hold the oil companies accountable. I think there's been instances of Exxon, they've had issues with their gas compressors, right? I work in the aerospace and defense industry, similar high-tech industry. There is very little room for errors like that. And for a company of the size and scale of Exxon, that's unacceptable. You cannot continue to have the same problem over and over. I know Exxon is accountable and all the oil companies are accountable to their shareholders, but they need to start being accountable to the people of Guyana as well. Because what we don't want to end up happening is we become a nation of wealthy people, but end up being unhealthy. And we don't live to enjoy the fruits of all our natural resources. So that's all we're asking for, is for our leaders to be more conscientious of the environment, to put protections in place to monitor and govern all the oil companies. And that may include starting to renegotiate the oil contracts from 2016 onwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prasad. Mr. Kusial, your perspective on where Guyana's future will lie if we don't renegotiate this agreement.
Yeah, I think I just want to, all the other folks had some really good points. I just want to add one point, which is something Dr.
Sure.
Vincent Adams had brought up. And that's the oil spill, the size of a BP oil spill. That was, I think, cost BP alone $65 billion US. That's money that Guyana does not have. And right now, that Stabroek contract is signed with shell companies. If you look at I think Chris Ram, over the last few weeks, he had the financial statements for 2020 of those shell companies. If you look at those shell companies, if there's an oil spill, there's no way the size of a BP oil spill, which I think Dr. Adams in Kaieteur News, he did mention there was I think a Spanish company in a different block, not the Stabroek block, another block, that almost had that type of oil spill.
Yes, that's a Repsol.
If you have that oil spill in the Stabroek block, and you're dealing with these shell companies will just say, hey, we don't have the assets, our net worth is zero. it falls back on Guyana. Where's Guyana going to get 65 billion US to pay for an oil spill? That would bankrupt Guyana. So it's to me, that's one of the most important things that needs to be fixed is have the insurance done be owned by the parent company, right? Exxon US, Hess US, CNOOC China. Have that insurance be owned, and they have the liability for that. It cannot be the shell companies that have essentially what amounts to zero net worth, and Guyana bears the burden. So it's almost like heads, the oil companies win right now with the contract, and tails, Guyana loses if there's a spill, right? So how can that be a fair deal?
Thank you very much, Mr. Kusiel. Which brings me to my next question, and it's at the heart of the work that's being done by the Oil and Gas Governance Network, which is education. Based on that, how crucial do you believe it is for us to have an educated populace in an economy that's led by oil and gas? And Dr. Jailal, I believe you told us that earlier that you also spent some time in an economy that was led by oil and gas. So it would be really interesting if you can share your perspective on that as well, a little bit about the efforts that's being done by OGGN to ensure Guyanese truly understand the importance of this sector and what they need to be asking of the government. Dr. Jailal, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so OGGN understands that Guyana has been in oil just 1.5 years. And so we had been unprepared in every respect, including education. And so oil production is happening so quickly that Guyana does not have much background in oil and gas apart from what the Kaieteur News is doing and other newspapers have been doing in small ways. So we realize a need for basic introductory education. So following the leadership of Kaieteur News and in support of Kaieteur News educational program, we created a few introductory educational products. And so we believe that once we provide a basic education on an ongoing basis, people will respond to the issues being raised, especially, for instance, the 27 questions Mr. Glenn Lyle has asked about oil and the contracts. He probably has asked more than 27, but there's a list of 27.
Yes.
And so hopefully people would understand that we have the worst contract in the world, and they would want to support the government by joining the call for renegotiation. We want to support our government to renegotiate this contract. We want people to sign petitions so that the government knows people want a new contract that would give more benefits to Guyana. We want our education to be effective so people would understand that Mr. Glenn Lyle and the Kaieteur News are on the side of the working people, the poor masses who need better wages, better education, better health care, seawalls, flood prevention, modern schools, health facilities, better roads, and housing, for instance. And so, as Dar said, we did some 9 videos, and that's small compared to what Kaieteur News has done. And in one video, we talked about some basic oil terms. So when people read the newspapers and they see FPSOs, they see onshore, offshore, sweet oil, heavy oil, if they read that the drilling found heavy oil, what's the implication for us? What's the difference between light oil, heavy oil, sweet oil, and things like that? So there's a whole video dealing with definitions. And one of the big projects we did is what we call a jobs directory. So if oil is here to stay and we're doing oil, we want people to have jobs. We want Guyanese to have many, many jobs in oil. We want our companies to have contracts in oil. And so how do we help people to find out what jobs are available? So we looked, we did research, and we didn't find anything from the Ministry of Labor or the Ministry of Natural Resources putting together a directory of jobs in oil. And so if you want more of your people to have jobs in oil, you would think that's the first thing to do. And so what we did was to do the research and come up with a 30-something page document where we listed some major companies in oil. We listed contact information like their email, phone number, address, and the kinds of jobs they have hired for in the past. And so people can go and look and go to the individual websites of those companies and keep checking for jobs. So the jobs directory, we think it's an important contribution to education in oil and gas. And so if we can look at that on our website, that would be very helpful. And so going along with that, there's a video, what women and hinterland and rural residents need to know about opportunities in oil and gas. And the reason for that is that everything is based in Region 4. And if you live in Region 4, you have better access to information. And if you live in the hinterland and rural areas, you're further away from where the oil action is. And so we have videos on what women, hinterland and rural residents need to know about opportunities in oil and gas. Dr. Ganga did a video on understanding costs and expenses in oil production. But we think that's important because when Kaieteur News writes articles about costs and auditing and expenses and things like that, people need to be able to understand what you're talking about. And so the more we can simplify it, we think it's the better for the people of Guyana. Then there is a video on environmental concerns and flaring of gas that we have been talking about. And when we say Guyana has a bad deal, we are benchmarking Guyana with Suriname. And so we have a video comparing the Guyana contract with the Suriname oil contract. Then we have 3 videos on the resource curves. And so you ask what would happen if we don't renegotiate. We have 3 videos dealing with economic dimensions, the political dimensions of the resource curves. So those are all available on our website, www.oggn.org. And if you go to education/resources, you can find all those videos there. And we did 5 infographics. And the infographics are like charts and graphs and diagrams. Once you click, there's lots of information in one place. And all of this was done in a very user-friendly way. It's good for students, for workers, for housewives, anyone who wants to know more about oil and gas.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jailal. Mr. Prasad, would you like to add your perspective on the importance of having an educated populace in an oil-led economy?
Yeah, so I just want to touch back on what I said earlier. Like the sessions going on right now for the gas to shore project, right? How do people provide input into that? It's complicated. If you look at the material that's being released by the Department of Information, there's a lot of complicated information there. But what we try to do is, as Jerry was talking, we try to provide the basics in videos, and so people can at least understand some of the terms, some of the aspects, and then be able to ask questions, like probing questions. I think that session, you had about 100, the EPA/Exxon virtual session. You had about 100 people, 100 Guyanese, and there were some very good questions, but we need more people, asking those questions and being able to understand. I know Kaieteur does some really in-depth analysis. You have some really good interviews, etc. But if you're at a high level in terms of what's being said, and then the folks, the person on the street, they still need to catch up. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bridge that gap so they can go to a video or something and see and be able to ask more intelligent questions, more probing questions to their politicians, etc.
Thank you very much. With time coming down on us for the wire here, I'd like to go to the next topic, which has to do with taxation. And I'll ask Dr. Ramdas to speak on this matter. We've heard a lot about the exorbitant concessions and tax waivers that are usually granted to the oil and gas sector. Many have said that Guyana should not, for example, be paying the income taxes for ExxonMobil and other oil companies. And others have said that there has come a time where we need to overhaul some of the concessions that we're granting to the sector. But what is the OGGN's perspective on this matter, especially as it relates to taxation? Do you believe the current state of affairs leaves us with the short end of the stick in our hands? Dr. Ramdas?
Yes, the payment of the taxes, I covered that already, that all the taxes should be paid from the oil resource, from the sale of oil. Now, in addition to that, the agreement is not in line with Guyana's laws. My big surprise was, as a U.S. taxpayer, that Guyana will be paying the company's taxes and that the revenue authority would have to issue certificates and receipts as if the taxes were paid. So that's problematic, and it reflects on the quality of the oil contract. So that is something that Parliament needs to look at to find out if that aspect was authorized. Now, the further research on Guyana's taxation laws, which were published, I think, today, showed that these taxes were not allowed under Guyana's laws. And reference was made to the Petroleum Exploration and Production Act. The second one was the Financial Administration and Audit Act. These did not allow or permit the government or the taxing authority to pay on behalf of the oil companies or to pay those taxes as under the income tax, property tax, and the capital gains tax. These are not authorized. So either they are ignoring Guyana's laws, bypassing the laws, or abusing the laws. So I find that very despicable in a country where taxation, late payments, and other fees are charged by the taxing authorities. What will happen to Guyana if it files a late income tax payment on behalf of the companies? Guyana will have to find itself and pay interest and penalties on the amount that Guyana owes to itself. So it's somewhat circular and doesn't make sense in terms of the law itself. So both the spirit and content of the law has been violated. And that's a further reason why this contract needs to be carefully renegotiated. We can't assume that it was carefully negotiated when there are so many loopholes in the tax laws, as we are now discovering afterwards as we implement the laws relating to the petroleum sector. So these things need to be revisited urgently and to regularize Guyana's laws and to make that the power of last resort. The power should not reside in a minister signing off and giving the authority to sign away Guyana's patrimony. I find that very abhorrent and unethical type of business practices. And as Jailal had enumerated, why Guyana needs to have its tax revenues is to pay for those floods and sea defense infrastructure, plus other related infrastructure, as well as to cover self-insurance in case there is an oil spill. These are areas where you would have catastrophic losses, and they're not covered anywhere that we can say and identify tangibly, yes, here's a pool of insurance monies that would cover Guyana's costs. And that's not how ethical business conduct is practiced, or how you tend to internalize costs that are likely to spill over on other people within business calculations. That's what we teach in business schools and economic schools, that all costs needs to be accounted for directly and indirectly. Otherwise, it would promote adverse behavior. It will allow companies to get away with things, as they say. And Guyana needs to revisit the contract from those perspectives, from the adverse spillover onto other entities, onto the Guyanese people, onto the Guyana's budget. Otherwise, we will endanger ourselves both socially and economically.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramdas. Mr. Kusiel, would you like to add any comments before we head into the wrapping up of our program?
Yeah, so on the taxes, we did produce an article that we looked at the profit share that was released by the government for the oil lifts, the 12.5% profit share, and we did calculate based on the March oil lift numbers, if the oil companies were paying taxes, they would have had to pay us based on the amount since December 2019 up to March, about $62 million US. And that's money that can be used, for COVID relief, and other projects where I see the government right now borrowing. And I just want to touch back on that Global Witness Open Oil. So in that, when they were asking for, a fair deal, they would just say, hey, move the royalty to get a fair deal, where Guyana is just in the middle of the 67 oil regimes, move the royalty from the 2% to 10%, and then impose 25% tax. And that's how you get, to be in the middle of the pack, which we would consider fair, right? And that's, as I said earlier, using the latest oil numbers and using the 9 billion barrels, that works out to about $75 billion US right now that we're giving away.
Thank you very much. So, gentlemen, with everything that you said, I'd like to wrap up tonight's program with just having your concluding thoughts on Guyana's movement with the oil and gas sector. If you're satisfied with our performance to date, and if you can offer a key piece of advice on how we ought to go about properly managing the oil and gas industry. Mr. Prasad, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I'll leave our listeners with one thing, is learn the basic terminology of the oil and gas industry, because I think that will equip our citizens with the ability to question our politicians, and more specifically our decision makers around our future. So I think that's the one key thing, is learn the basic terminology of the oil and gas industry and have dialogues with our decision makers and leaders to make sure we're holding them accountable to their decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Ramdas, your concluding thoughts and your key piece of advice on how we ought to properly manage the sector.
Yes, my first point is that all costs, including taxation, must be covered from the sale of petroleum oil. That's the first principle. The second is the schedule of cost recoveries must be streamed in such a way that Guyana's fiscal stability is not endangered, that the budget must have adequate resources to pay for public works, for flood control and everything in a timely manner. So these things must be ensured that it does happen. And then the distributive justice part, that the monies that Guyana has received must be divided in a fair manner, and I'm not going to put any population profile on that. It must be split between consumption and investment, perhaps 50-50. And the 50% that goes into investment could be leveraged through financial institution to maybe get 5 times that amount to build infrastructure. But most importantly, given all the layoffs and the mobility of the labor force, the part that goes for consumption must be direct transfers to households as part of their heritage and their ability to go and build new businesses, start new companies, because they have a resource individually. They can buy new lands, they can get into farming and so forth. So distributive justice is very important. If this does not happen, the economy will collapse, because there's an old theorem on the exhaustion of product. If you don't enable the people to consume the output, the economy will collapse. And so there's a danger that if distributive justice does not occur, the economy is likely to suffer as a result, and that would hurt everyone.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Kusiel?
Yeah, so first, I just want to point out where Dr. Jailal was talking about education and job resources, etc. If folks go to www.oggn.org, and at the top of that website, there is a link to the job resources, which Dr. Jailal constructed like a 35-page document about all the oil companies and the links to the oil companies, etc. And then there's an education tab where you can click that tab and you see the 9 videos, the infographics, etc. I would like to say, people should get more involved. And I'm just going to give a simple example. We started in 2017, just starting writing letters. We didn't have any expertise in oil and gas, and we're writing letters, etc. I will give an example where we collaborated with Kaieteur News a few months back. In terms of, we were just trying to calculate based on the data, the lift data, the oil lift data. We don't have production data. How much Guyana was actually getting? Is it the 14.5% that most people say from Lisa 1, or is it less, or is it more? And just by doing that exercise, just going through, asking the questions, etc., and we did collaborate with Kaieteur News, and then they were able to at least get us some data, which they used the Natural Resource Fund Act 2019, and they pointed out by that act, the government should be releasing at least lift data, and that's the first time we started to see some lift data appearing. That was in March on the government website, and then we're still not able to calculate the true percentage Guyana is getting from Lisa 1, because we don't have all the production data, but at least we were able to make an estimation on what the taxes would have been owed if the oil companies were paying the 25% tax rate that Guyanese businesses were paying. So I just wanted to give that example. You just start. You can start from zero, and you just keep learning. But the important thing is to start, get involved, etc. Ask the question. The amount of this oil industry is transformational for Guyana. It can have a negative impact where the oil spill can destroy the whole country, or if managed well, etc. It can have a positive impact if we get a fair deal, etc. We can build the seawall defense and not going and begging other countries for COVID vaccines, etc. We can actually pay for those, etc. Right? So at least I think it's a very transformational. It can have a transformational impact. So people should get more involved.
Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Jailal?
Yeah, Kiana, I agree with what Dar said. Transparency is very important as we go forward. Guyana is a signatory of the ISAZU agreement and the EITI, which is a Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And so under those two memberships, the government has an obligation to release a lot of data. The current government has given less production data than the previous government, and I think they're going into the wrong direction. They need to change course quickly. Also, we need to involve the opposition and Parliament in major decision making relating to oil and gas. We see what non-involvement of Parliament and the opposition gave us, a very bad Stabroek Block contract. And so going forward, we should not repeat that same error. And so we would encourage the government to look to see what new laws need to be enacted to govern the oil agreements, and so that we can take back control that we ceded to the oil companies. We need to require payment of taxes, or if we're going to keep paying Exxon's taxes, let them give us a bigger share of profits and royalty. And we also need to build a strong EPA and build the technical capacity we need to manage and govern oil and gas. And my concluding thought would be to call on the listeners and the people of Guyana everywhere to support the Kaieteur News campaign for renegotiation. Kaieteur News and Mr. Glenn Lal is doing the right thing, and all of Guyana needs to know that. And all we want to do is to strengthen the hand of our government. We love our government and we want to support them to be strong, to summon up the courage to say to Exxon and the oil companies, we need to sit down and relook at this agreement we have here. Our country has many needs. Everybody is crying out for their roads need to be built. This need to be done. A poor country like ours, so rich, the richest country in CARICOM, but we have the lowest currency and one of the lowest standard of living. Something is wrong here, folks. And so we hope that Exxon and the oil companies would have a conscience. And with Kaieteur News leadership and the government of Guyana coming on board and being strong, and we are supporting the government, let's renegotiate this very, very bad oil contract that we have right now.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Jailal, and to the other members of the panel for this evening. Thank you all as well for your contribution. And I do look forward to having you sometime in the future back on governance, corruption, and justice. So thanks again. To those who tuned in, thank you for your usual support, and we look forward to having you part of our next session. Until then, please stay safe, practice social distancing, and please get vaccinated if you haven't already. Good evening, gentlemen, and good evening to our listeners and viewers.
Thank you,
Good
Diana.
evening.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dennis.
Diana.